Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahin, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Nour and Ismail. On today's show, we are actually recording in Houston, Texas, from the Texas Dawah Convention, and we are with Sheikh Mohammad Elshinawy, who just gave a speech talking about the importance of fathers in families. So, Sheikh Mohammed, first of all, thanks for coming through. Kind of got you back to back. You just spoke, and now I've got you here recording with us. So, how's it going? And why was this subject so important for you to talk about today?
Well, it wasn't. I was cornered into giving it. I mean, interestingly, as I was just mentioning earlier, at the Yaqeen&nbsp, where much of my time is spent research towards them, they say that I'm the lucky one who gets the hugs and marshmallow subject, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, God is mercy, and how do we understand His mercy, and the prophetic message, how do we know it was genuine, things of this nature. But a subject this controversial, and what made it controversial, I guess, partly is that I'm fully aware that if I would have just said, dads need to man up, and just did it a man bashing rant, that would have been very culturally competent of me, and I would have got a lot more likes on social media and all that good stuff. But it would have been very inauthentic and I, to a certain degree, a bit treacherous to my audience. That there's an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, and that we all need to juggle this monster of the parenthood struggle,
right?
Collectively, dually. And that it falls on both shoulders.
Sure. So amongst our hosts here, I'm sure we have a varying degree of experiences with fatherhood. Obviously, Nour can't be a father unless she changes her gender identification. But she has a father. Ismail has 4 children, and I'll let him get into his story a little bit, which some of y'all listeners know about already, but not from this angle, maybe. And then myself, I have 2 daughters. And I've got a dad who's still alive. So, that's my example, so to speak. So, I actually want to let Ismail talk a little bit about his experience, as a dad, or lack thereof, however you want us to spin it.
So, Sheikh, your talk was very difficult to listen to because, all of the, problems that you were talking about that occur as a result of absent fathers are all, issues, or many of them are issues that I'm dealing with personally. And basically every one of your bullet points was literally like, a bullet to me. But Jazakallah khair, because it really needed to be said, what you said. And I have 4 children. I was in prison for 13 and a half years. My youngest was 6 months old when I was arrested, and my oldest was 4 or 5, and I've been out of prison for a year. And so parachuting into this situation is very difficult to handle, because I see what, my absence, the damage, I see the damage that has wrought in their lives.
Yeah, and then statistically speaking, so like Ismail, I know the Sheikh mentioned a lot of statistics as far as the one, for example, women being more likely to engage in relationships, illicitly in fatherless homes, the suicide rate going up, the amount of people in prison disproportionately come from fatherless homes, so to speak. So, have you noticed, Ismail, in your time, like red flags that as you're jumping back into fatherhood now, that you're trying to kind of get your arms around?
Well, without trying to put my kids on blast or anything, I'll just say, generally speaking, that many of the topics that you discussed were hit home very personally. So I was wondering maybe if you wanted to elaborate on some of the problems that come about from absent fathers.
Actually, before you, I want to ask a question about, cause you mentioned, one thing you mentioned about is that teenage girls who don't have an active, like that paternal affection, right? How they may get into, an illicit relationship. I honestly don't see the connection there though, because a father's love is different than a husband or a boyfriend's love. Like, they're not gonna get that kind of when a 13-year-old girl gets butterflies in her stomach, it's not going to be from her dad, right? Like her dad isn't going to be the one satisfying that.
Can I respond to that as a female?
Go for it.
Okay, so alhamdulillah, I did grow up with a dad. There were moments in my upbringing where my father was able to be more present than other times. Nevertheless, those moments where he was mentally absent, those definitely contributed to this longing feeling of having stability, security, be it financial, protective, authoritative. And alhamdulillah, my mom was very affectionate, merciful, all of the things that the sheikh, mentioned during his lecture. But there was this feeling of we're constantly walking on ice and we don't have this secure foundation. And for me, that definitely contributed to this feeling of wanting to find someone who I could lean on, a man who I could really just rest my fears on. And there was nothing sexual about that. You know what I mean? It's just this feeling that is provided through male presence that a female presence does not give you.
And interestingly, if you remember at the end of the lecture, the claims made by some behavioral psychologists like Dr. Omar Johnson, he said that the reason why homosexual tendencies are more prevalent in African American communities, low income in particular, which have these systematic breakages, right? Systematic racism, systematic breakages in their homes by way of incentivizing, I guess, single motherhood, by way of drugs being subsidized, by way of mass incarceration, whatever it may be, it leaves these sons with a sense of longing to be held by their father. Mm-hmm. And yes, that's different than being held by a partner in a relationship, but that was misconstrued, right, by society. And if you drill something home enough times, it just sticks, even if it isn't perfectly consistent with my thought process.
And
right?
With boys and girls, isn't there a tendency to sexualize love? In other words, to transfer love that normally would be, of a sort of familial nature, to transfer that into sexuality?
I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing that I took from your lecture, I don't know if anyone else has some points regarding that point I made. So as understood, I think it's not a direct correlation, right? As far as like the butterflies in the stomach, like necessarily are, but they're if I understand you correctly, that need is kind of met by the father in a different way, from a different angle, that kind of prohibits, so to speak, the girl or the looking for like a boyfriend. Is that what you're trying to say?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely. I mean, I know these are anecdotes, but in my multiple but isolated incidents, when I'm reached out to by sisters that have fallen into pregnancy, and when she explains what it would be like to go back home with this, she says, no, I don't mean it figuratively that my dad's going to kill me if he finds out I'm pregnant. No, my father is literally going to ship me back home and bury me because death before dishonor. So there's clearly an absence of affection that she may not even realize when she actually thinks her father is willing to spare her life for his own social status, right? His tribal standing in whatever country this young sister may be from.
Can we actually take a step back and just provide the listeners a little bit of the statistics that the sheikh mentioned during his presentation? You said that, first of all, you started off with the clip from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which I thought was brilliant. Not only
the sound was working.
But everyone knew that episode.
Yes,
I turned to Noreen,
who
was sitting to my right, and I was like, did you see that episode? And she's like, oh my God, it was like one of the best episodes ever. And I remember watching it when I was a kid, and for me, it resonated in some way. And I'm somebody who, alhamdulillah, did have a dad at home, but there was still some sort of emotional connection. And the episode was when Will's dad comes back, and then just ducks out, early, and Will catches him, and they're supposed to go to like a game together, and then he pours his heart out to his dad. But so you talked about the ways in which during the 1950s to the 2000s, there's this like sitcom dad persona, and that sitcom dad persona is both reflective of society, but also informs the way that fathers then see themselves. So we should talk about that a little bit more. But you also mentioned that 20 million children in the United States are fatherless. 2 out of 3 teen pregnancies do derive from fatherless homes where females are looking for fatherly love. And then 71% of high school dropouts are from fatherless homes. And the reason I want to share these statistics is because, you know, there are a lot of people who still don't think that this is a topic that is urgent and that we can talk about gender reversal roles in trivial terms. But when we think about these statistics, which are, if not correlative, directly consequential of the ways in which we trivialize gender and the biological differences between men and women. So I just wanted to put that out there for listeners to keep in mind.
Absolutely. I mean, there's another element to this discussion that we didn't really visit during the lecture, but Sheikh Ismail with his words reminded me of it. Interestingly, the discussions that are, I guess, had in the public sphere, in modern thought in general, they may not visit this because it's all about, you know, we have reached this point of advancement in the modern world now that we can now reevaluate what gender even means. And that's already a sign of privilege, right? Like that you can go about and rehash what your family's even going to look like. That excessiveness, that excessive liberty that we take, and we don't look at how detrimental it is the very factor that destroys the homes. I mean, I don't have numbers to prove this, but if you go to war-torn countries, fatherlessness is not as devastating. Why? Because the threat to the home was external. And that's why even when we said in the lecture, the Prophet ﷺ was an orphan. Some of these great imams were orphans. Their father was taken from them. He didn't jump ship, nor was it a tug of war and the kids were the sacrificial lamb, right? And so when the house is threatened from the outside, mom doubles down and she becomes the mom and the dad because she has to. She didn't kick Allah's guidance to the curb and, I guess, strip herself of the eligibility for his supplemental aid, if you will, right? Though all aid is from him. And the opposite is also true. Like when the mom is lost due to whatever, the father becomes the mom and the dad, and somehow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rescues these kids. As opposed to in our societies when it's almost another manifestation of the unrestricted freedoms and choices of, no, you get out. I can do anything you can do and better. And so when we're playing that tug of war, when the breakage is happening, the implosion, the attack, everyone gets protective of the family. Fatherlessness isn't as detrimental. Whereas when it happens as an implosion internally, await Allah's support that it will come. I mean, when Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khadir are sent to a town to take care of these 2 orphans because their parents did everything they could and extraneous factors tried to attack their home, ultimately somewhere down the line, even if it wasn't mom and dad, a prophet and arguably another prophet, Al-Khadir alayhi salam, came and protected these kids, right? And so the same way he intervened with our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he intervened with the children of those 2 righteous people, using as instruments Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khadir, assume the best of Allah for your children, bi'idhnillah, that they will get past this hump. And they'll come out of it, inshallah, stronger than they went into it.
In a similar vein, one of the things you actually mentioned when you were talking about the 3 unique things that fathers have to offer, you were talking about financial security, which was the 3rd point, and you mentioned that 60% of children who end up in financially secure situations in which there is an absent father are actually caused at the expense of the mother's absence because she needs to double down, work outside the home, that sort of thing. So how does that fare out with what you just mentioned?
Again. One more time.
So when you were talking about financial security, right, you mentioned that, 40% of children who are in homes without fathers end up being raised in poverty. But then there's that 60% that are financially secure, but that's the result of mom having to go out and work and then come back home and be mom at home. So in the wisdom that you just shared, how can we grapple or deal with that discrepancy in our modern times when mothers are in that kind of a situation, whether it's because the father himself chose to leave or because it's due to a divorce or he was torn away from the family?
Yes, ultimately, and this is the utility of our conviction, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the utility of faith, right? Reliance is an action of the heart. So long as there's something to be done on the ground, we must do it, while having our hearts certain that it's not really what we do that's going to have a direct causal relationship with the outcomes. And so Maryam alayhi salam was asked to shake to breadwin, if you will, in an abstract sense of it, to shake the trunk of a palm tree for edible ripe dates to fall upon her so that she can nourish herself and lactate for milk for her baby. If you think about that on a completely materialistic level, it's just like a grown man, not a woman who just went through labor and bled. A grown man cannot shake a palm tree and bring dates out of it, right? But this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaching us through these noble, beautiful figures that you do your part and I'll make things happen.
SubhanAllah.
So, one of these, a sort of well-known progressive, liberal, intellectual woman, professor, recently got herself in the controversy by calling Ibrahim alayhi salam a deadbeat dad. A'udhu billah. Why is that wrong? Why is that wrong that by leaving Ismail and Hajar in the desert, why was this not an act of abandonment and absent fatherhood?
Absolutely, because ordinarily it would be like if nowadays, with the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being completed, definitive guidance being established, sealed, finalized, if someone leaves their child somewhere, we as Muslims are supposed to call the cops, right?
Yeah.
Because we are obligated to treat things at face value. We are not certain. We are not certain exactly why he did that. It could be that he was mentally incapacitated, right? It's still dangerous, but not conviction. Convicting this person, prosecuting them, it's a completely different type of action now, right? And so we are to deal with things at face value, based on preponderance. Most likely this person is being negligent and is committing a crime, and we have to act on that because certainty is so rare in this dunya of ours. We're not omnipotent. We can never see things at all angles. The scientific process itself is not absolute because we're constantly improving in our ability to understand the world around. It's just on every level, right? But Ibrahim alayhi salam, he's receiving instruction from an absolute truth. This is revelation. This is way different, right? Same thing like the story of Musa al-Khadir alayhi salam. He went and killed the boy.
Right.
Like anyone who kills a kid in front of us, we're supposed to take actions. We're liable for not taking actions. But because he says, وَمَا فَعَلْتُهُ عَنْ أَمْرِي, I didn't do it on my own accord. If this is from God, then case closed.
Right.
Interestingly, I came across this vicious discussion on insulting Ibrahim alayhi salam, which is so unfortunate, but perhaps, the silver lining is it's good when people's true colors come out, right? When Allah reveals to the mother of Moses to put her child in a basket, is she a deadbeat mom? Right? It was revelation. And Ibrahim alayhi salam likewise placed him in the desert as a matter of revelation. We believe that absolute truths are from God. And this is not wishful thinking. This is not blind faith in Islam. We have very good reasons to believe the Quran is from God. And so we take that as an absolute truth. The prophets had even stronger reasons. They didn't have faith by persuasion or by conviction or a rational process that got them to accept the Quran as the word of God. They had faith by experience, which is the highest level, right? They interacted with the divine directly. They were privileged to get to that level. And so what they know, they are even more certain about than what we know from revelation.
Now, I wonder if you could add to that some thoughts on when Ibrahim alayhi salam went back to Ismail and Hajar, and they didn't know who he was. Are there any lessons? And he tried to teach his son some things by his visits. I wonder if there are any lessons in that for your topic here.
Of the most important lessons, and I'm constantly seeing your story now as you started with it in the backdrop. I'm not sure if I'm reading into things too much.
Can I learn anything from this?
I mean, fatherhood doesn't end, right? Fatherhood doesn't end until the wave separates you, right? Nour alayhi salam and his son. He called out, tried his best until the very last minute. Interestingly, an elderly man came to me and asked me to pose a question to Dr. Hussein Shualt. I don't know if you remember him from Northern Virginia. He was there when the Insititute was there, Mahin was there. Mm-hmm. And he said to him, my daughter has disowned me. She just became a high-end physician, and ever since the divorce, 30 years, I haven't really been talking, or was it 20? And so please ask this sheikh, because he trusted him very much, if my daughter has a right to inheritance, because she's basically asserting that she's not my daughter, I'm not her dad, and that's it. And so basically the sheikh said, go back to him and tell him she doesn't make that decision, and that I know this is extremely difficult for a parent to digest, but you need to go initiate a relationship with her now, so that Allah may forgive you if you were at a certain level, at some percentage, part of the reason why the relationship went south. Yeah? And so our responsibility is until we breathe our last. And in the end, it'll all be worth it. And all these hardships, they'll make sense in the end, inshallah ta'ala.
Sure. So, Sheikh, how old are your kids? If you can, are you allowed to disclose that?
Sure.
I mean, you shared photos, so I think we can.
Oh, no.
And by the way, I was going to say that I don't think you're as detached from the subject as as you said in the beginning, because I think you're actually very well qualified to talk about this.
Absolutely.
Being a father. Yeah.
MashaAllah.
So, because I'm a father, I can speak about fatherhood. But then you're disqualifying me from being able to participate in the gender discourse because I'm not a woman, so I can't speak about women. Right?
Oh.
That's usually the comeback I get whenever I speak about women's rights in Islam. They say, listen, why are you speaking about women? Why isn't a woman up here speaking?
You don't find that
this is banter, by the way. I tell them I'm not a Palestinian and I still have to speak about the Palestinian cause.
That's
I tell her I understand your grievances. I understand no one can represent you the way you can, but am I allowed to add my voice to your voices? And at that point, they kind of concede to me being a spare wheel in the conversation.
You've clearly done your homework, and your presentation was very thorough and at the same time very succinct. So I think even if you weren't a father, you certainly have given this topic a lot of deep thought and nuance.
So, I mean, the reason I asked the question is so all of us have kids at various ages, right? I've got right now I have a 4.5-year-old and a almost 7-month-old, right? So it's how do we, what are can you talk a little bit about the phases of fatherhood? I know you didn't talk about that in the lecture, but, obviously my 7-month-old, there's really the kid does what she wants, right?
Right.
A 4.5-year-old though is a little, you're starting to maybe disciplining here and there, but I don't know what, you're kind of playing it by ear, so to speak. So, and then with Ismail, who's got 4 teenagers, right?
Yeah.
He's got a different mode of how he's interacting with them, right? So can you talk a little about the phases of fatherhood that we should be?
Can I just specify that a little bit more? One of the things we didn't even talk about is, are we talking about fathers to their male children, or are we talking about fatherhood irrespective of, whether they have girls or boys?
There's no rule of thumb.
Yeah.
And that's from the genius of the Sharia, because when you specify things, it doesn't become that simple prototype that can be applied across the board, right? There are certain values, such as overemphasizing on positive reinforcement, for example, over negative reinforcement. When Anas radiallahu anh says that I served the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for 10 years, he never told me about anything that I did. Why did I do it? Anything I didn't do, why didn't you do it? Right? And so that's huge. There's so many studies out there today about the the efficiency and the effectiveness of positive reinforcement. The concept of smothering them with love and kindness and warmth and the stuff that we guys aren't as good at, right? I personally remember my mother has never gotten upset at me. Ever.
It's because she's Egyptian.
Perhaps.
Right?
Or maybe I was a really good
Palestinian
kid.
and
My
Syrian
mom jokes
moms.
that I'm such a good kid. She didn't know she was pregnant with me until 6 months. I'm that great to my parents. No. No, actually, there was like a family situation. My dad's sister had a tumor, and they were back and forth. And my mom had also just.
She thought you were a tumor?
No, man. Low blows at the conference. My sisters were twins.
Okay.
The year prior. So there was a bit of relativity being played here. She didn't feel me inside. Plus, they were just back and forth with the surgeons, and everyone was visiting from Egypt, and maybe her being Egyptian adds a bit to it as well. Okay. We can do a session about my mom later, okay?
There's actually a reason I made that joke because my wife's is an OBGYN doc, right? And so sometimes they get referrals from other like internal medicine docs, and they're like, "Hey doc, we found a mass in someone's body, and they thought it was a tumor, and it's moving and it's growing, and it was really a fetus, but they thought it was like cancer."
Oh,
so it is like it's a common joke amongst doctors that sometimes the non-OBGYN docs will think that they'll see a mass in someone and they'll think it's cancer, but it's really just a baby.
And,
How did we get into
the
this?
reason this is important to the topic is because...
No, it is a side segment.
He's trying to validate the tumor joke, I guess. I'll forgive you somehow. Just
clean
give
it
it
up a
time, I think.
That's why we're Mad Mamluks. This has to be relevant.
Or rude mamluks. How about that?
Oh, man.
But yeah, so in general, there's some like overcompensation of love, etc. What about the scenarios? We talked a little bit about the mom kind of being that kind of the warm and cuddly figure, and the dad's the disciplinarian. But what if our natures are like? For me, now I have daughters, right? You always hear that dads are always going to be like more affectionate towards their daughters, and moms towards their sons. These are just things I've heard. Now I find that my wife is more disciplinarian towards my kid, to my 4-year-old. Whereas I'm not so much, but maybe it's also because I'm never home. So therefore, when I'm home, I'm not with her long enough for her to get on my nerves. Right? But I think our natures are different. Like I'm more of a laid back personality, and she's more like a disciplinarian. She's a more disciplined person. So how do we like factor that in when sometimes our natures may be contrary to that whole, what is the ideal dynamic?
I mean, human beings are so complex. I mean, just to reduce the human being to the value of mercy or of, discipline, justice and whatnot, I think would be a disservice. That's first of all. Second of all, I think you should be having this conversation with experts, and not myself. But just in general, there is a great blessing. If people can just appreciate that Islam gave us ideals to live up to begin with, right? Like, it is so hard for young married couples when they come and explain to me, I just laugh at them because they think their problem is so humongous. When I'm telling them, Akhi, if it was not impermissible, I tell you that so many people that you know so closely have the exact same deadlock in their marriages. But part of that is the identity crisis in our culture. Like, if I don't know what idealism for a man is, masculinity is, and femininity is, I'm not going to work towards it. Like, I'm going to drive northeast for a day or two and say, maybe I'm going the wrong direction anyway. Let me try to fit a different mold. And so there are general molds to be held, and people, like, Islam, even in its determination of gender qualities, is not a monolith, right? There's a spectrum of validity in both, right? Aisha radiallahu anha is not Khadija radiallahu anha. They're just different personalities, different women. Men are the same as well. The spectrum of masculinity and femininity, there's an ideal with an acceptable diversity within both, right? And that's a huge step forward that we may not value as much if we don't see just people on the ground. That's why when people have this discussion, many a times I'm just like, do you have a spouse? Do you have children? Like, do you realize what negotiating these, I guess, standards every single day will look like? And so that's a good place to start. The Quran is rich with guidance, rich with guidance on what masculinity looks like and what femininity looks like. And the prophetic example is actually the archetype for both, right? In the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right?
Do you find that the confusion about gender roles in America has penetrated the Muslim family? I mean, that's almost a rhetorical question, but so sort of the sitcom dad that you mentioned in the evolution of that. Do you find that in the couples that you counsel as well?
So this epidemic, if we can call it that, is globalized because our cultures are globalized, right? By Allah's grace, the command of Islam over the Muslims remains evident. So like if we're going to say that 1/3 of children now in the United States are born outside of wedlock, inshallah, I don't think we need statisticians tell us that's nowhere close to it inside the Muslim community, I'm hoping, right? And it's in some communities as far as like 66%. I think the value of chastity, the value of saving yourself for marriage, of one partner, marital partner, that does away with many of the sabotaging of families that occurs in just if it feels right, do it culture, right? That's one aspect of it. And also, people are still informed, even if it's culturally, by a culture that's a little bit of a mix of Islam. And I remember Sister Nour, she was talking about this in her podcast with the Bad Mamluks when I came across it. People, even if their Islam is culture, there's still some semblance of Islam there, right? The value system, the norms, what is taboo and what isn't taboo. And alhamdulillah, it's dangerous because culture is king. Right? If you repeat something enough times, it just sticks. You keep telling people America runs on Dunkin', you're going to think Dunkin' Donuts is good coffee. I always use that example. So it's not? Islam is terrorism over and over again. It doesn't really matter what the studies show, what the policy centers show. Nothing matters, right? No polls show. You repeat it enough times, it just becomes established. ما تكرر تقرر, as it says it in Arabic.
So, question for both you, Ismail and the Sheikh. How do you learn, like, when you become, it's a personal question, like, how do you learn to become a father? Like, okay, we get married and then eventually kids will show up, but like, where did y'all learn?
You're assuming we've learned.
Or, I mean, you're speaking on the subject, I assume you're an expert. If you're speaking on it.
No, absolutely not. I really wish I was. I mean, I don't read as much on parenting as I would like. It has been in many respects become, like many sciences, disciplines nowadays, turned into an exclusive genre of study. And that's definitely useful. I mean, seeking out the cures for our children's psychology is just as important as seeking out medical treatment for their physical bodies. But again, not skipping the Quran and the Sunnah is huge. I mean, just the disconnect. Like when I meet parents and I tell them, your child, I found pornography on his phone, and he says, Wallah, ya Sheikh, I wish I could, I don't even know my son's number. I know you're not going to believe me. And it's just like, akhi, like, this is common sense, first of all. Second of all, like, we have in the prophets of God just the most beautiful, timeless examples. Ibrahim alayhi salam goes to his son and says, God's telling me to slaughter you. So he's checking up on his son so his son doesn't disbelieve last minute, right? Like, I need to know that they're in good standing. When the Prophet ﷺ, for example, trains his grandson from very young that, don't you know that charity isn't consumed by Muhammad or the family of Muhammad ﷺ. You remove the date from his mouth because that date was donation and they don't accept donations. Allah, I guess, preserve them above that accusation by having their income come from alternate sources. There's so much, right? How he dealt with the youngster, how he dealt with someone when they were just unknowing of a mistake, as opposed to how he dealt with someone who knew it was a mistake but was being lazy, as opposed to how he dealt with someone who knew it was a mistake and was being hard-headed about it. All of that exists in our tradition, right?
Sure. Well, what about Ismail? Like when your oldest is a son or a daughter?
A daughter. It went girl, boy, girl, boy.
Okay.
I think that I really watched my mom and my dad, and I watched my dad and how he was My dad was very, very merciful and gentle with us, and that was the example that I followed. And I don't think I consciously did it. It's just, I wrote a letter to my oldest daughter when she was a little baby, and she found it about 5 years ago. And yeah, it was a letter that I wrote to her saying about how I couldn't wait to watch her grow up, and and all the, her, as her personality unfolded and this type of thing. And so she found it and was really moved when she read it. So I think that's what we do. I think that we just watch our fathers and we do that. And which actually kind of struck me because I was not there. So when you were speaking, it struck me that, if we're not there and we learn from our fathers, well, who do our sons learn from when we're not there? And that's...
the African proverb says that, it takes an entire village to raise a child. And so if the village is entirely inside the tube, the screen, whatever it is, right? Then that's what's going to inform their lifestyles and their worldview. And so we have to be very protective of what these sponges soak up.
So one of the, as I mentioned, I was in prison for 13 and a half years. And because of for institutional reasons, and all kinds of different complex reasons, we see that African Americans make up the vast majority of prisoners in the United States. What kind of effects have you seen in your counseling of Muslim families? What kind of effect have you seen on the African American community of this huge population of African American men in prison?
This is an observation that I haven't seen so much myself as much as I've heard it from those more involved in the leadership of African American communities, certain very respected, very seasoned imams, Siraj al-Hajj and company, right? The veterans, that just because a person enters into Islam, just as the Sahaba did, it took them a long time to get cultured onto them, the Islamic paradigm and how we understand the world. And so we may find the numbers in terms of divorce rates, for example, far closer to the epidemic mainstream than it is, for example, with a person that father, grandfather, great-grandfather, or grandparents, for that matter, were upon the Muslim value system. And so that's been a huge challenge, aside from the odds being stacked against them, politically speaking, socially speaking, against the demographic. And so I do believe at heart that the African American community is what will make or break the Muslims in America. And they have the longest heritage here and the greatest potential here through their Islam, not at the expense of their Islam. And so that's our responsibility, is to not see them as contributors to Islam, right? We have some African American. No, they are a part of Islam. They're part of the chefs. They're not some ingredients that were added, right? And the people, the Muslims in the United States, this could be a rant, but the Muslims in the United States, if you think of the Arabs, the Desis, they're a self-selected group of privilege that came here because they could afford to come here. And so if that translates into an aristocratic mindset or some bit of exclusivity that they reflect, and we have fallen into this in many respects, then we're going to lose out on the biggest asset for preserving the Muslim identity here in the West, which is what I believe as I believe it is the African Americans.
Yeah. There's a lot of wisdom around humility in what you just finished describing. And I think in general, the ideals that you are preaching, which are clearly rooted in Islam, are for many Muslims today a tough pill to swallow. So by virtue of the era in which we live, where things like gender fluidity and the LGBTQ question are increasingly acceptable among progressive Muslims, the ideals that you're advocating for that are rooted in the Sharia are still nevertheless difficult for many Muslims to accept. And one of the things you mentioned in your presentation is that there's a difference between exploring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom versus objecting to it. So could you talk a little bit about humility, individualism, and egotism, and why those are barriers to being able to fulfill the rights and responsibilities of fathers?
Well, some people, especially in the Islamic spheres, don't like to hear this, but I honestly believe that we need to demand more humility of ourselves than of anybody else in our audiences, because I feel like preachers, Muslim thought leaders across the spectrum, to be honest, we fumbled many conversations. Part of the reason for that is a lack of humility. We speak from a high horse. So when we speak about, for example, I don't know, lusts and promiscuity and permissive culture, as if these things don't exist in Muslim culture. Or when we speak from a very unnecessarily assertive or judgmental perspective, like one of our words at Yaqeen that we like throwing around to each other is compassionate orthodoxy. Like, we can not be apologetic. We can be unapologetic about our fundamentals in Islam, about our constants in Islam, without being offensive, right? And that's so much better at focusing at, because this is something in our hands. We can't change how people are. We can change how we are. There are so many conversations that I believe we have fumbled and pushed people off trying to deconstruct instead of offering with humility the counter narrative. Deconstructing is leaving someone in a void, leaving them in despair. You know, if I tell you secular feminism is X, Y, and Z, and this is what's wrong with the internal inconsistencies in it and all this stuff, a person's going to say, well, my father's version of Islam is not something that I'm willing to accept, right? And so we have to own up to these things. The LGBTQ discussion, we fumbled it bad, I believe, for the most part. And we fed into the stereotypes that were, you know, we gave so much free ammo to the opposite narrative that we actually are people that are pro-bullying, non-acceptant of anyone unless they're angelic. And that's not the Islamic narrative, right? That's actually from another faith tradition, right? That lusting in and of itself is a sin. That these things are not part of our tradition. And so we need to not reclaim our tradition, almost recraft our presentation of our traditions. And this is very possible, but it requires humility of us. It's just like this whole tone of, this is Islam, you like it or you don't, my way or the highway. It creates more alienation. It could create more secular feminists than it actually wins over. It could create more people that are disenfranchised about God accepting me for who I am, in the sense that I have these struggles and my pace is going to be slow. Not validating what's contrary to Islam, obviously. That's not what
that sounds intended. Like we have that problem. A lot of us are culturally Muslim. Like, we were born in the Muslim families. We came from Muslim majority countries. Ismail was a convert, but like Nour, myself, and you know, grew up in that kind of environment. I guess, and this is, I don't know, Ismail, I don't want to like, appropriate on your behalf, but I find that people who convert to Islam in America have they have a much more nuanced view, and that they're not influenced by the cultural things guised as Islam and how, you know what I mean? But what kind of advice would you have for people who grew up in, like for us, like you mentioned the LGBT issue, right? We say if you engage in that activity, it's a sin. But there are other sins. But that sin, for example, for us is very much it's considered a greater abomination than anything else, in a way.
But that's cultural,
you know.
But also,
we don't go haywire about the banking system, and riba is worse than zina in Islam, right? And so I think we were drawn into the gauntlet and used as a spearhead for this conversation when it doesn't benefit us or what we're calling to, right? We are 1% of the population, and we don't have well-established high-end channels for compassionately, if we're going to be compassionate to begin with, compassionately asserting our opinion. So assuming that people know what our position is, and we're just crossing the T's and dotting the I's by rebuttaling the dominant position, we are not as big as we think we are. And so we have to tread with a bit of tactfulness. Forgive me.
I'm sorry as well. But isn't there a sense in which we abandon our duty to call for healthy families and societies by remaining silent on things like, for example, gender fluidity or the trend towards acceptance of same-sex marriage, because these are all part of the general dissolution of the family. So don't we have an obligation to, in a compassionate way and tactful way and wise way, speak out for traditional marriage?
Absolutely. I mean, not just that. I may even go as far as to say that there are people that determine their narrative by what is culturally appeasing, and so they shy away from certain subjects, fearing this. No, it's a greater act of compassion and mercy and selflessness to accept that there may be some occasional possible backlash for just saying it how it is, out of care for the rest of the world. Like, if I believe there's a burning building, I would be hypocritical to say, no, you're fine and just everything's all right, you know? And like, I wouldn't be a good doctor if I know this cheesecake is no good for you. And so, like, listen, man, it's just another slice. And that's not me being a nice person. That's not me being courteous or polite in any way, right? I'm dissuading people from their own well-being. But should there be a but? Look, I agree that appeasing the masses is just as disgraceful as appeasing the rulers, right? And we have these legendary imams in Islam who like went down history, and we cry whenever we hear their stories that they risked life and limb for just speaking the truth at the expense of their own lives. And that appeasing the masses is the same exact thing, right? You fear their wrath, so you're going to conform. But like in Sahih al-Bukhari, when Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that if the first thing to come down from the Mufassal was the last thing to come down from the first to come down from the Quran was the Mufassal, which is the last part of the Quran, Surah Qaf to the end, according to, I guess, perhaps the stronger opinion. And she says, and it has a mention of God and paradise and the hellfire. And when people began becoming inclined to Islam, then the halal and the haram came down. She said, and if the first things to come down were don't drink wine, don't commit fornication, they would have said, we'll never stop these things. And so the rulings are secondary to the convictions. And there are lots of people out there that are just having a crisis of faith. Like, I remember they called me up in New York City to like come do some damage control on some event where people flipped out about the whole sex slave concept. And the speaker, with pride in Islam, basically he said to them, whether we can ratiocinate or not, this is Allah's religion. Basically, he was invoking their faith. Like, are you Muslim or not? This is Quran. Right. And then he said, Allah says that the statement of the believers when they're invited to Allah and His Messenger, they say we hear and we obey. He's assuming the audience has enough faith to accept that. And that's not always the case, right? If I say that 23% of Muslims today no longer identify with their childhood religion, they don't self-identify as Muslims, what does the 77% look like? These are people that identify. It could be a cultural identity, ready to be moved when it's not worth it, when it gets too hot in the kitchen, when it's just... So, assuming that they are ready and they don't need to be reinstated in their faith, the middle Muslim is a very, very dangerous gamble. And so I think doubling down on that, I am Muslim for very good reason, very rational reasons. My mind has delivered me to this is Allah's deen. He has revealed this. He has sent Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now I'm going to put my mind in the back seat. Not going to turn it off, but I'm not to arbitrate, not my discretion of accept or reject, but what does Allah want of me? The desire of the divine. How do I comprehend that? That's it. But for many people, that's not the case. Like, if the ruling, they are, no, there can't be a hellfire. Forever? No, there has to be another opinion out there. If there's no other opinion, then I'm ready to leave Islam. No, he couldn't have married her at 9 years old. If he really married her at 9 years old, I'm so done with this religion, right? That's something that I've seen ubiquitous in all communities, all across the board. And so I fear calling people, I mean, we shouldn't address them in a way that is accusatory. We suspect their faith or lack thereof, but we should keep in our minds that they may not be as able to say is, I accept. Eyes closed. I'm with Allah and His Messenger. I'll understand later. It's problematic. I've seen it many a times really hurt people.
Now, do you mind if I ask? I think that many among the Christian community have realized that they also blew this when it came to the issue of LGBTQ, and they essentially, by being harsh and vindictive and condemnatory for many years, essentially burned many people out on the concept of religion at all, and drove many people away. And clearly we want to avoid that same thing. Now, one, I think, tack that many in the Catholic and Christian community are taking is to make kind of a natural law argument for traditional marriage, and to say that this is beneficial to society to have one man and one woman. To what extent is that a valid approach for Muslims to say, I know we're talking about fatherhood, but not only about fatherhood, but other things like, for example, gambling and other things, is making that kind of argument in some way sort of betraying the idea that, well, it's Islam, we're submitting to Allah and this is what He says? Or is that a legitimate thing to do for us as a minority to say, hey, our what we view as moral and what we view as good, we believe that this is good because God says that it is, but it also has these other benefits. Do you think that's a good approach for us to take when it comes to whatever, fatherhood, same-sex marriage, gambling?
I
alcohol?
believe so, definitely. Yeah. I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the deen is deen of fitra, right? The natural disposition. This is the natural, good, pure way. Human nature, God who created the human mind and the human body and the one responsible for every existential aspect of us, right, is the one that revealed the verse. The creator of the universe is the revealer of the verse, as someone put very eloquently. And so it's going to match. But number one, we are not dependent on being able to decipher the wisdom of all things. I think that's the only place where people need to tread with caution. Because if you knew the wisdom of all of Allah's rules, then you would be Allah. Right? And He's the most wise, not us. And so if I need to understand everything before I approve of it, then my God is not God. Right? My God is me. My mind. Human intellect is the ultimate authority. And that is the fitna of our age, right? Like, when the philosophers first got their works translated into the Muslim Ummah, we are in the new Mu'tazilite age, right?
I was just going to say that.
It's all over again. And so it's amazing how history repeats itself. And this is the new fitna of our age. But secondary, like, for example, pork, just the simplest, I guess, staple haram of Islam. Muslims don't eat pork. Everyone and their mother knows that, right?
It's our kryptonite, according to...
Yeah. Pork blood, or what is it? Pork fat?
Yeah.
So we now know that the number one cause of death in the United States is heart disease, and like a big contributing factor to that is whatever, right? Bacon for breakfast with the eggs. Allah spared us of having to wait 1400 years until someone pulled that experiment off, right? Number one, we've been protected from, immemorial, or at least 1400 years. Allah said so. That's it. Mm-hmm. It's not because it's unhealthy. Because what if someone invents a pill and tells us, well, now I have a pill to counteract the harmful effects of pork. Is pork halal now? We say, no, there could be other wisdoms why it's haram as well. Allah made it haram. Case closed. The full wisdom, maybe Allah will treat us to it on the Day of Judgment. And there's so many examples of things like this. Also because our human intellect is so open to manipulation as well. Right? Like even how we perceive fat to begin with. I don't want to get scientific here, but it was just amazing. The Harvard Business Journal 2 years ago, when they were talking about how the sugar industry funded the research on fat to decoy. right? It was just insane. Like everyone was on some trip for 40 years, and all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, the soda industry paid us.
It was a marketing scheme.
Harvard researchers, the most credible, to put together think tanks and publish peer-reviewed articles on the dangers of fat. It's just like, oh, okay, so I guess we were wrong. Even the things that we're sure about, all of a sudden we're not sure about them anymore. And now saturated fat is all of a sudden good for you.
Well, one thing we're sure about in the context of this entire topic is that behind every great man is a great woman. We can
I
all
love my
agree on
mommy
that,
very
right?
much, yes.
I mean,
Right? But, the elephant in the room when you were giving your presentation was that in order for men to really rise to the occasion and to quote unquote man up, women also have to play their part. They have to do their part. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on that during this episode. So
dang, I was hoping we'd
thought
run
you
out
were
of
getting away
time
with it.
before we. Okay,
We never run out of time.
so give me a pointed question so I can.
a pointed question. What do women need to do in order to help sort of mitigate this crisis of absent fathers without absolving men of their responsibilities? Because you actually did go through solutions for ways in which men need to man up. So for anyone who's listening and who's undoubtedly going to say to me, why are you always pinning it on women? Why do women always have to,
Nour reminds me of the example you gave, the opposite bias. You remember? Or that example?
Yeah.
Like your bias, like a woman generally is biased pro-female, but she could be perceived by some folks as compensating for that and being more pro-male. That's why we have our Mad Mamluks.
Well, just seeing it from as balanced a perspective as possible, right? Like, men have to revisit what authority means. That's one of the points that you touched on. You also talked about what paternal affection needs to look like and how that is a staple as well. It's not just about the authoritative role. And then really taking charge of their sacred responsibility as the financial breadwinners in the family. Okay, so what are women supposed to be doing then? Because this is a complementary union. And if he is going to fulfill his roles, then I'm supposed to be doing something too to help buttress that. What am I supposed to be doing?
Well, I mean, as we mentioned in the talk, that the father can offer a semblance of structure, a semblance of authority and discipline, and the numbers sometimes lie, but the numbers are quite compelling that the father can do it in a way that nobody else can. Right. Especially, by the way, in our modern times with the nuclear family. Like, if the father doesn't do it, we don't have the extended family for the uncles and the grandfathers to jump in. Like, when the Prophet ﷺ, even from a rational perspective, was orphaned, that made him the prized child of his grandfather. He loved him more than he loved his own kids. Because, oh man, there's no one there for him but me. And so, even from that rational perspective, aside from coming from the divine, that doesn't exist anymore. And so the man has to have his role as the authority, as the disciplinarian, respected, right? Interestingly, one of the scholars even, he said that imagine authority had been placed in the hands of the mother. The child is naturally, and they should be, emotionally biased in favor of the mother to begin with. Imagine authority was in her hands, the father would be totally done, right? You just get steamroll. No, there's no leverage for him whatsoever. And without providing that structure, that solid mechanism for the child to grow up in life, understanding, as we said, life is give and take, and more give than it is take, they're going to suffer so much, right? Alienating fathers from their right and their children's right of fatherhood. Like, no one's even allowed to give up these rights in Islam. Islamically speaking, in terms of custody means where the child is sleeping, right? And whether young or old, boy or girl, these variables do have an effect in the judiciary process in Islam. But at the end of the day, it's about the child's well-being. Like, a mother cannot give custody to the father in the first 2 years of marriage because the child has a right to breastfeed. She's not allowed to, because it's not your right. It is your right and the child's right. Likewise with the father, he cannot give up this role voluntarily because no one can fulfill it the way he does. And so if that's challenged internally, the children will suffer a great deal. Incarceration, we spoke about, the suicide rates, the drugs, the dropping out of school. 80% of the kids, of the adolescents in psychiatric institutes come from fatherless homes. If they're not given this, their lives are going to be a mess.
So if, in terms of just like a quick list, what are some of the things you see women doing in marriages or families that is contributing to the stripping of their rights and responsibilities, the men's rights and responsibilities as fathers?
I mean, in the Muslim sphere especially, the perception that the man is, I wouldn't go as far as to say, as some people say, that the man just is essentially a... I'm trying to find a softer word. A biological contributor. But listen, you're the spender. That's your job, right? I see that a lot in the Muslim community. A man, first of all, he'll rebel. Not saying this is right Islamically, but if I'm just a spender and I'm not even appreciated for the spending that I'm doing, then I'm not even doing that much, right? And so Islam does protect us from our own vices, right? The same way it tells you don't commit zina, but it gives you a whole list of things before that so that you don't fall into it. Likewise, it says don't compromise the equilibrium of parenthood, and here are a bunch of ways to do it, right? And so the man feels meaning. Allah created men to feel meaning in serving the family, right? This sense of accomplishment, if you strip a man of it, the whole family will lose, right? Again, if this is done voluntarily. And so conceding to that, allowing the children, to see their father as not authoritarian, but the authority, the respected authority in the house, is something that she will benefit from as the mother more than anybody. Because at the end of the day, the man is not supposed to be micromanaging. He's not supposed to strain the relationship. He's supposed to be, hey, your mother said finish your homework, right?
Those words still ring in my head. And I'm 31 years old now, but I clearly remember the whole wait till your dad gets home.
Wait till your dad gets home.
So, wait till your dad gets home. So 13 and a half years later, I get home, and my ex-wife now was saying that wait until your father gets home. So now I came home, and not to get too personal, but my ex-wife says that she has had more problems with them in the year that I've been out than she did the entire time that I was in prison.
Yeah.
And I think we're gonna spend a lot of time trying to figure out why that is. But one of the problems that I'm experiencing is that, so a lot of the literature that I was reading before I came out, and then when I knew I was going to get out, was along the lines of don't expect to come into your household and think that you're going to be able to sit
Your
there.
seat is waiting for you.
Yeah, exactly. And think that you're going to be able to be a father figure, an authority figure all of a sudden, because, they have not grown up with you with that. And so this is one of the, it's perhaps a unique situation, but, do you have any advice on how to handle that situation? Because on the one hand, when I'm sitting there and handing out dictates, that's resented. But on the other hand, I don't want to, as my ex-wife says, leave her to be the bad guy, and everything.
Someone has to play good cop, someone has to play bad cop.
Right. So I'm between these two bad things. And when I did initially, I took that into account, but at the same time, I couldn't just let myself be run over or watch my ex-wife be run over by the kids. So I would try to be firm, and that was met with resentment. So it's a very puzzling situation.
It is puzzling. And of course, you already know that they were forced into a situation where they had to improvise. And that must have been viciously demanding of them, right? To reconfigure the structure of the house, missing a leg of that structure. And so being extra patient with them for the sake of co-parenting, even beyond the marriage now. I've personally found it, this is a bit off topic, but even parenting a masjid, like administrative, right? I have some very humble brothers, alhamdulillah, at my local masjid. But by Allah's grace, I feel like one of the big reasons why we're able to avoid this imam board rivalry that exists in so many places is by Allah's grace. I mean, a younger me would not have done this. I would have totally ruined it. is that I kind of showed up and I took less than what was given to me. Like, make a decision. I'm like, no, that's your decision. No, that's your decision, right? And after that behavior of mine allowed me to be perceived as someone who's not threatening them, the vulnerability feeling, the defensiveness was gone. And now I'm being given more and more and more because they're not afraid of me anymore. I'm not suspect in their eyes anymore. And I think that's probably the only way to go. It's going to take a deep breath, the long haul, for the sake of the kids. I mean, that's what parents are about, right? Being dedicated and devoted. Their acronym for dad, as some people put it, right? That whatever's going to get these kids to Jannah, I'm not going to be selfish about it. I'll sacrifice myself for my children, even if it's so not me. I'll make it me for the sake of these kids.
Yeah. I think the biggest takeaway from your lecture and also certainly. The episode today is like, just for dad, just be like, I think it's being purposeful in your parenting, right? And always thinking about it. There isn't a one, like, shot solution to everything, right? Everything's circumstances pop up. Like, like, you don't plan for spending 13 years in jail in your life, So, make that easy for you and your kids and, help and all that stuff. And, people, there's divorce situations, all kinds of situations. I think it's all about, like you said, what I heard is, when you become a father, you touch upon your religious instructions that you've learned from the Quran and the Sunnah, and then but always be purposeful in thinking about that in a day to day. Cause, that's kind of what I took away from it. There isn't like, it's a very organic relationship, right? More than anything else. It's not a formula that when this happens, do this.
And nothing is dependent on us. Wallahi, that's so liberating to remember. Nothing is dependent on us. If I die tomorrow morning, life will go on. The kids are still going to eat dinner. My wife's still going to move on with her life. The lectures are still going to go down. Nothing is going to change, right? Everything is dependent on Allah. Nothing is dependent on anyone, not even the prophets of God. So sometimes we carry this burden for a very, very long time that it could have been a different way. And so the Prophet ﷺ just shuts that down and says, Ista'in billahi, ihras ala ma yanfa'uk. Be keen on what is good for you. Wasta'in billah, and just seek Allah's help. Wala ta'jiz, and don't be weak. Like, it's meaning we decided to feel powerless. We're prohibited from feeling powerless. I mean, it's in our hands whether we feel powerless or not. And he said, and don't say no. Don't say low. Don't say if this and if that. No. It could not have happened any other way. Right? And I always, subhanAllah, it's interesting, Sheikh Ismail, he's unearthing many emotions for me today, because about 8 years ago, I was always wondering. I was like, man, something's going to happen to me. Either the angel of death or the FBI or this or that. And I wrestled with these thoughts for a long time. And I'm not the first or the last. This whole exam paper called Dunya is going to get crumbled up and shredded very soon. And what is 100 years divided by infinity?
Sure. That reminds me, actually, of before I had kids, Ustad Jesse McKinsey, Ustad Jesse?
Yes,
yeah, he's a good friend of mine. So I was telling him, like, my worst fear for my kids, other than apostasy, is for them to end up gay. Right? And he was like, okay, and he was like, and I was like, I could do everything in my possibility, but something could still happen. He's like, yeah, for sure. I got 8 kids. I have at the end of the day, Allah's in charge, right? So, and then that sunk in. And I think that's kind of what we're, talking about today. We always have to drop the LGBT example, but like, seriously, that was like literally what I told him. Like, I still think about it. Don't get me wrong. It's still a fear, but at the end of the day, it's still something that, you realize that you're not in, you do what you can as far as your means go, and then, we still have leave the rest up to Allah.
As Allah said, لكي لا تأسوا على ما فاتكم.
Right.
ولا تفرحوا بما آتاكم.
So Sheikh Mohammed, as we wrap up, how can people find out more about you? Do you have? I know you're doing a lot of work with Yaqeen. Shout out to Yaqeen Insititute. We did a podcast with Sheikh Mohammed, right, on the proofs of prophethood. Was it?
Yes.
I think we got some more. There should be more popping up soon. But where else can they find more about you and whatnot?
I guess social media, where everyone else exists.
It's a good idea.
Yeah.
We'll put some links, inshallah, to some ways to get a hold of you.
Whatever it is.
And you're in Allentown, PA, right?
I'm in Allentown, Pennsylvania right now. I'm still a New Yorker. I'm loyal. I'm there every Sunday for my mom.
Okay,
but I'm about an hour and a half, west in Allentown. Budding community there.
Right, for sure. For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook, so like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. We're on Instagram, and we don't get to come to TDC for free. We don't make money off this podcast, so we are looking for donations. You can donate to us at www.themadmamluks.com. There's a donate page. For our special guest, Sheikh Mohammad Elshinawy, and my co-hosts, Nour and Ismail, this is Mahin, signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalam.
Wa alaikum assalam.